state-of-the-art scientific evidence on muscle recovery. So these are my interests that I need to declare before I start speaking. So I am a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of Enhanced Recovery, but get no financial interest in that. The concept I want to present to you today is around exercise and the fact that it's a stress that requires rest and nutritional support to recovery. This curve represents what happens to homeostasis within somebody who's performing exercise, in that they have a perturbation as a result of exercise that requires restoration afterwards. We talk about this recovery phase as being beneficial only when it's accompanied by adequate nutritional support and adequate rest to allow what we call adaptation. Too long, however, and you can see that the curve declines, and this would be a period of detraining. We can talk about this in respect to something like strength or speed or agility or any skill that you might want an athlete to have. When we repeat this stimulus, of course, that's what we call training. So the curves would look something like this. Instead of allowing detraining, we get a further increase and then a subsequent increase. And in doing so, we change the baseline of the athlete. This would be successful adaptation and require adequate periods of rest and nutritional support. So how do we support recovery nutritionally? I like to think of it in terms of threes. The first thing is rehydration. The second is refueling. And the last thing is repairing or remodeling. This is called by some the holy trinity of recovery. In other words, we have the three things that are most important. I'm going to focus today on repairing and remodeling because that's been the focus of the research that we've been doing in my lab for the last 25 years. The concept I want to bring to your attention is something called protein turnover. And I like to use a brick wall to cement the analogy. Bricks going into the wall is amino acids going into protein. We refer to this process as muscle protein synthesis. You'll see it represented throughout the presentation by these yellow curves. At the same time, we have simultaneous bricks coming out of the wall, which we refer to as muscle protein breakdown. These are damaged amino acids being taken away and proteins being broken down so that we can maintain optimal function. So with respect to the model that we just talked about, I'm going to show you an integral part of remodeling the protein matrix within skeletal muscle. On this picture, you'll see two curves emerge. One is protein synthesis, or the bricks going in, and one is protein breakdown, or the bricks coming out. So when we wake up and we consume protein, we get a pronounced stimulation of muscle protein synthesis, and we get a suppression of muscle protein breakdown. In this state, synthesis is exceeding breakdown, and you can see that this green area, which represents a small amount of muscle protein being accrued or gained, is unfortunately only transient. In other words, it's only when it's supported by a meal. When we get to our lunchtime meal, we've gone through a period of gray that's almost equal in magnitude to the period of green, meaning we've lost the gains that we once gained. But we eat our lunchtime meal, we see a further stimulation, then we eat our dinner time meal, and finally we see the third stimulation of the day. Not represented in this picture would be a large gray bubble at the end of the day, which is when we're not eating protein. But you can see very quickly that it's changes in muscle protein synthesis that dictate these fluctuations in the balance on a day-to-day basis. So that's the process that we aim to support in promoting recovery. So how does this change with exercise? Quite simply, when we perform exercise, it doesn't matter what type, but we've been focusing on the impact of resistance exercise and remodeling muscle tissue, we get an enhanced anabolic response that looks something like this. In other words, the exercise has sensitized the muscle to the provision of protein and more amino acids are incorporated. At the same time, you can see that in the fasted state, we actually lose less muscle protein. But it's still muscle protein synthesis that is dictating the predominance of change. So we need to support that process in order to promote adequate recovery and prepare the athlete to compete again. Well, what about protein dose? One of the first studies that we carried out a number of years ago now was conducted by a PhD student of mine, Dan Moore. And in this, we had young men engage in a strenuous bout of leg resistance training, and we randomized them to consume one of 5 different protein intakes: 0, 5, 10, 20, or 40 grams of protein. What you can see is that the muscle protein synthesis response plateaus when these individuals consume 20 grams of protein. We realized that there had to be some variability in this estimate. It might be a little bit smaller for smaller athletes or a little bit larger for some. But the surprising part, I think, is when you average this intake out, it comes to about 1/4 gram of protein per kilogram per meal feeding. I think what's really impressive is that when you fast forward after having done a number of these trials and a number of other labs, including my good friend and colleague, Dr. Kevin Tipton, and his colleague, Dr. Oliver Wittard, you can see that we did a compendium in this series of analyses here of all of the individuals in 7 different studies, and we actually came out with a requirement that was no different from that which we got in the original dose response study that we conducted. So it still speaks to an amount of protein that on average is somewhere around 20 grams as being maximally effective at stimulating muscle protein synthesis. But what does it look like throughout the day? Sarah Oikawa, my former PhD student, drew this really nice graph to illustrate an important concept. Most people consume protein in an imbalanced fashion. A small amount at the breakfast meal, a potentially larger amount at the lunchtime meal, but oftentimes their largest amount at the dinner time meal. And you can see that Sarah's included a pre-bedtime snack here, and this is this overnight loss in muscle mass that we're talking about because we're not ingesting protein. Bearing in mind that protein synthesis is stimulated in a dose response fashion, and that per meal threshold is about 0.25 grams of protein per kilo per meal, you could see that an athlete that weighs on average about 75 kilos is only hitting that protein threshold twice, at the lunchtime meal and at the dinner time meal. At the breakfast meal, you can see that they're suboptimally stimulating muscle protein synthesis, and in fact missing an opportunity to take advantage of amino acids in the bloodstream to effectively remodel proteins. The importance of this can't be understated because breakfast is the first meal of the day that somebody has the opportunity to refine and actually remodel their muscle proteins. So it may be a good idea for this athlete to supplement their breakfast meal with a little bit of extra protein in order to meet that protein threshold. An important point I want to make, however, is that this threshold for stimulation, the so-called anabolic window, is open for a long time. It probably depends on the intensity and the severity of the exercise, but we speculated previously that the first opportunity to refeed immediately post-exercise would be the most advantageous, but there's still an added anabolic effect maybe that lasts up to 2 days afterwards, which reinforces the concept to athletes that every feeding opportunity they get is a chance to practice one of those 3 R's: rehydration, refueling, or the addition of carbohydrates, and repairing and remodeling. The last process, the remodeling, being the slowest of those 3. This is not, however, a hypothetical graph. It's in fact based on, I like to show this because it's a paper of mine, but it's getting pretty old now, to show you that it is in fact based on science showing that for up to 2 days after a strenuous bout of exercise, there's a stimulation of protein turnover. It's a slow process that takes time relative to the reestablishment of hydration status, which can happen within 30 minutes, or the repletion of used muscle glycogen in the form of carbohydrates, which can happen in the course of about 24 hours. So an interesting question is, when are we at our longest period then of muscle loss? Well, of course, it's when we're sleeping because we're not ingesting protein and we need to do something about that. This would be an optimal window for promoting recovery in athletes because it's a time of regeneration and rest anyway. From a neurological standpoint, perhaps we can turn it into a window for rejuvenating muscle. I'm going to show you these data from Tim Snyders, who was a student in Luc Van Loon's lab at the time that he did this study, showing that in individuals who were performing resistance training, those that consumed protein prior to going to sleep gained an extra amount in muscle cross-sectional area as versus a placebo group. I think the really interesting part about this study is not that they gained more muscle, but that there was actually a functional outcome associated with this. In this situation, you can see this is the sum of all of the strength in these athletes, and it was greater in the athletes that consumed protein prior to going to sleep. So it could be that a more optimal prescription, as opposed to just 3 meals per day, could be something like 4 meals per day. And in fact, when we talk to athletes, we talk about meals as an eating occasion in which to practice the process of those 3 R's, trying to recover as effectively as possible. So perhaps the more optimal way to consume protein throughout the day is something like what's shown in this slide. It would imply, however, that all of the meals would be about the same size with respect to the amount of protein that's consumed. That may be tough. Supplements can be useful in these situations to make up for what some meals may lack, or have some meals where there's more protein, cut back on that and emphasize a different nutrient, be it carbohydrates or lipids. But there is another important feeding occasion, as we said, and maybe that's prior to going to sleep. And so this large gray bubble at the end of the day is really what happens when people don't consume protein. So maybe there is an occasion for a pre-sleep protein-containing meal to provide a further anabolic stimulus while the athlete is sleeping. So perhaps to sort of bring it all together and show you what my protein recommendations are to promote remodeling and recovery, it would be 4 equally spaced protein-containing meals. I've increased the protein intake from about 0.25 to 0.3 to cover some larger athletes per kilogram of body weight per meal, and 1 pre-sleep meal, which is a little bit larger. And the reason it's larger is simply because people usually spend at least 7 to 8 hours sleeping and not eating. So we're trying to offset some of that overnight fasted state loss. I've done the calculation here for a 70 kilogram soccer, or I can say football here, you all know what that means, a soccer player. And you can see that it's only about 119 grams of protein per day, or about 1.7 grams of protein per kilo per day. Simply, that's almost twice the recommended dietary allowance in Canada. I understand from European recommendations, it's still twice as large, but it's to show you that it occurs in 4 discrete eating occasions during the day and 1 pre-sleep meal. The interesting part is we can obviously scale these calculations, and here are the same calculations done for a 50 kilogram female soccer player. The important point, however, is that dose and meal spacing are important. You simply can't consume all of the protein at 1 meal and expect to get the same type of benefits. Now, all of these things that I've shown you to date are maybe theoretical. I've got protein synthesis curves going up, muscle protein breakdown curves. And I guess the question a lot of people ask at this point is, does any or all of this matter? Well, the university I come from, McMaster University, is very fond of saying they are the home of evidence-based medicine. So I'm going to give you a little bit of evidence-based science to emphasize that the effect is actually there and you can see it. And so this brings me to the presentation of Rob Morton, a former PhD student of mine, his meta-analysis to look at the question of whether protein supplementation actually affected people's ability to gain muscle mass if they were lifting weights, the analogy I use is that they're effectively then repairing and positively adapting to that stimulus, and it makes them stronger. The simple answer is this is what we call a forest plot, and it's lined up all of the studies along here, and you can see that they basically waffle around this sort of 0 point that says, you know, it favors control in this direction or favors the protein supplementation. And the diamond here represents the overall effect in untrained and in trained individuals. For reasons that aren't fully clear to us, you can see that in trained individuals, they actually benefit more from protein supplementation than untrained individuals. Probably because they've tapped out their genetic potential, they've been training for a long time, and so the degrees of freedom that you have to initiate change or positive adaptation in somebody who's practiced are much fewer. But the manipulation of diet remains an effective strategy. So you do get a little bit stronger, and at the same time, the exact same message applies to the gaining or remodeling of muscle mass. You can see that it's effective, primarily driven in well-trained individuals. So there is an impact of protein supplementation. At the same time, one of the things we did in this study was to use all of the studies and look at all of the protein intakes and say, how much fat-free mass or lean mass do these people gain when they go through a training protocol? So we used the DEXA data that's available from each point on here. You can see is actually a study. And we looked at the point at which we got an inflection and there was no further increase. This is this breakpoint analysis that I showed you a little bit earlier with respect to the protein intake. And then what we do is we add a confidence interval to increase the chance that we're bringing in all of the people in all of the studies. You can quickly see that the inflection point is at about 1.6 grams of protein per kilo per day. And when we add the confidence interval to make sure that we're covering everybody's needs, it's as high as about 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram per day. So the takeaway points from this meta-analysis are the following. First of all, dietary protein supplementation augments changes in muscle mass and strength. In other words, it allows the beneficial positive adaptation that you see in these athletes, so we're successfully adapting to the stimulus of training. At the same time, it's more effective in trained individuals, probably because the degrees of freedom that you have in trained individuals to affect change are narrowed down to a much smaller number of possibilities, and dietary protein provision, and I believe that the timing probably becomes more effective for these individuals, is augmented. Finally, protein supplementation beyond a daily protein intake of maybe as low as 1.6 or as high as 2.2 during resistance exercise training provides no further benefit. So you can average these meals out. It would be 4 times 0.4 grams to achieve the minimum, if that's how you want to feed your athletes, or it would be a little closer to 4 times 0.6 grams per kilogram per meal to achieve the higher end of the intake. A really important question, however, is are all proteins created equal? In other words, if we were to just put any protein in a drink or consumed post-exercise, would it have the same effect? And this really comes down to 2 points. How digestible is the protein? And what is the active amino acid in the protein that is stimulating the process? I can tell you that the branched chain amino acid leucine is really sort of like the trigger molecule. It is a branched chain amino acid that stimulates all of the processes, including stimulation of this signaling protein called mTOR. I'm not going to give everybody a biochemistry lesson, and we now know how this works, thanks to work from David Sabatini's lab at MIT. I'm going to use this study by Tyler Turtwood-Vinay, a former PhD student of mine, to illustrate the point. Remembering that protein dose, is important in stimulating muscle protein synthesis, we're going to talk quickly about what the design showed here. So this is a design in young men having performed a strenuous bout of exercise, and we're feeding them either 6 grams of whey protein, which is a very small amount, 25 grams of whey protein, which is obviously, we think, a saturating amount. It's going to fully stimulate the process of muscle protein synthesis. Or we've taken a small amount of whey protein here and we've added back a substantial amount of leucine, just leucine. Or we've added back that same amount of leucine and included the other 2 branched chain amino acids, which would be isoleucine and valine. What you can see is the stimulation of muscle protein synthesis in the first 90 minutes. It doesn't matter what you consume, so long as you consume some protein. However, the consistent and sustained stimulation of muscle protein synthesis is only seen in the larger dose of whey protein here, or in the small dose of whey protein to which we've added back leucine, which is an indication that it is leucine that is the key amino acid that triggers the rise in muscle protein synthesis, and you can sustain that so long as you have adequate leucine. Interestingly enough, and a lot of people are puzzled by this, why when you add the other 2 branched chain amino acids, I beg your pardon, when you add the other branched chain amino acids, do you see no effect? Why does it look exactly like the small dose of whey protein? And the simple answer is that the other 2 branched chains compete for entry into the muscle cell with leucine. And in doing so, then, they actually diminish the effectiveness of the leucine. So that's led us, and it's not just work from our lab, to propose this concept of what we call this leucine trigger hypothesis. And it goes something like this. The amount of leucine inside the cell, the concentration, has to rise to a certain threshold to effectively stimulate a process of muscle protein synthesis. But as you can see there, the trigger moves. Well, what causes this trigger to move up and down? Quite simply, that's what exercise does. Every time we exercise, we make the muscle more sensitive to the effects, not just of protein, but primarily to leucine. And in doing so, we can stimulate muscle protein synthesis during that time period. But the trigger doesn't stay there. In fact, if we would take an athlete and if they sustained an injury, for example, or took a prolonged period of time away from training, the trigger goes in the opposite direction. And so you either have to feed somebody more protein or more leucine. So this really speaks to it's the quality of proteins that are contained in any recovery drink or recovery meal that are important to bear in mind how much leucine the protein has to be able to effectively take advantage of this mechanism. So hopefully I've convinced you at this point that protein is important, and there's no doubt that it is. I think the important point would be, is there anything else that can augment the effect of protein? So a quick review of the literature would say there probably are some compounds. We can talk about protein. It should be a high quality protein, contain a high amount of leucine. We can talk about vitamin D. We now know that there are receptors for vitamin D on skeletal muscle, and that a lot of athletes in the prevalence of vitamin D, either deficiency or at least insufficiency, is quite high, particularly at northern and southern latitudes. I'll also introduce the concept that omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids are remarkably effective in enhancing what we call anabolic sensitivity. We're not quite sure yet what the mechanism behind that is, but it could be related to something called membrane fluidity. And that means that when you eat more of these omega-3 or N3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, that the membranes in your cell become softer and proteins within those membranes actually function more efficiently. So we're talking about protein. We could be talking about sunshine, but maybe that's not practical. And a lot of people say, oh, what about skin cancer? And totally right. And a lot of people know that omega-3 fatty acids are highly prevalent in oily fatty fish. A more pragmatic way might be to take a vitamin D supplement or to take a concentrated omega-3 fatty acid oil. And I say that not because I don't enjoy fish, but quite simply that the intakes of the oil that would be required to exert a benefit are pretty high, and the amount of fish you'd have to eat would be pretty substantial. So I'm going to introduce to you a concept that we call response heterogeneity, and it goes something like this. In a population of individuals to whom we expose to some exercise intervention, quite stereotypically, we would get a response that looks something like this. This shows the change in some score in these individuals from their pre-training values, and we would get this sort of heterogeneous response. Some people, it almost appears, don't benefit at all, or maybe even go in the opposite direction. Some people have a very sort of mediocre response, whereas some people lie in the top portion here. If we separate this into tertiles, which is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, this would be the lower, the middle, and the upper tertile. That's a frustrating experience as a coach. If we're going to expose all of these players to some type of conditioning program, this is something we care about. What do we do for these athletes down there? What about these athletes? Are they really benefiting from the training we're giving them? These folks seem to be fine. What we would ideally like to do is to change the response to make it more homogeneous and greater benefit, so that it looks something more like this. In other words, we might still have some athletes down here that aren't going to benefit from the intervention we have. We have some in the middle, but we're getting much greater, more beneficial responses in this upper 1/3. Quite simply, if you're a coach and you're applying this sort of thing, it implies the training stimulus has covered and is benefiting more of the athletes that you're training. That's the principle behind the use of multi-ingredient supplements. I'll show it to you in the population form. These are our athletes. We're going to exercise them all. We give some of them more protein. They weren't getting enough previously. We give it to them closer to their exercise bout. Whatever it is, these athletes right here, we've now corrected something or done something beneficial for them to allow the exercise to exert a positive effect. We give the same athletes a vitamin D supplement, and we get a few more of these athletes that had low vitamin D status, and we correct it. At the same time, we give them omega-3 fatty acids, and we now have 1, 2, 3, 4 more athletes that were very low in omega-3 fatty acids who are getting a response. The benefit really comes when we combine all of these things. And now we begin to see that more athletes in this population are supported from a nutritional standpoint that previously weren't. So now when we add the blanket stimulus of resistance training or interval training or long distance training or just training per se to recover, we don't get this response, we get something that looks more like this. So taking it one step further and putting all of this together, how are we going to combine those benefits? Well, this is where enhanced recovery comes in. And I think the important point is it's a true innovation from a beverage standpoint because it combines a lot of the things that we talked about previously as being beneficial. This is the ingredient panel, and you can see that it delivers from a standpoint of the omega-3 fatty acid content. This would be the polyunsaturated fats right here, more than any other sports drink that's out there. And it does so, I would add, in a very palatable, good tasting format. I'll quickly add that it's covered by informed choice, and it's also, the fish is sourced from an ethical source. So what's inside enhanced recovery that makes me want to stand up and say, this is a pretty good drink? First of all, I think it's important to emphasize that it contains one of the most efficient sources of omega-3 fatty acids. It delivers 1.6 grams or 1,600 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids. And I don't know whether many of you have spent time tasting beverages or eating pills or concoctions that contain fish oil, but I have to tell you that I have, and that this is one of the most fantastic tasting drinks out on the market. The important point is we're integrating these omega-3 fatty acids in a food matrix. They consist of something called EPA, or eicosapentaenoic acid, or DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. These are the two key long-chain fatty acids that are remarkably important in neural tissue, and we're beginning to appreciate in muscle as well. So from the standpoint of the omega-3 fatty acids, I think that there's another aspect to this which is remarkably important. The inventor of this, Janne Sanderson, is a genius in my mind. This omega-3 fatty acid emulsion that is created in this drink contains antioxidant vitamins, naturally occurring fruit polyphenols, which results in an antioxidant environment that prevents the oxidation of these amino acids, or excuse me, fatty acids. So used to talking about protein. So the clear comparison is to say, well, why don't we just take omega-3 fish pills, something like this? And the advantages are listed, and you can go to the website and check this out right here. But just to summarize, I think the key and important ones for you, they're stable against oxidation. In fact, I would venture to say that a number of trials from a health standpoint, both heart health, cognitive health, you name the health outcome that have been done with omega-3 fatty acids, are inconclusive because when delivered in this format, a lot of the omega-3 fatty acids get oxidized. And in their oxidized state, they could actually be detrimental. So there could be somebody that is responding poorly to taking omega-3 fats in this format. At the same time, there's greater absorption of the omega-3 fatty acids in this format because it's part of the food matrix. So there's a nanodroplet dispersion technology that essentially makes all of the omega-3 fats in the beverage here much more bioavailable. And I'll add, it tastes great. And I can't emphasize that enough. I have done a lot of work with a lot of food companies who've tried time and time again to come up with an effective omega-3 fatty acid delivery system, only to end up with something that is, yes, remarkably effective, but tastes so poor that there is no way you could get an athlete to drink it. That is great that it's an effective system, but if you can't get athletes to take it, it's never going to work. And that's not the case with this beverage. So what about the protein blend? And I emphasize here that there are three sources of protein: whey protein, sunflower source proteins, and collagen. And the simple answer is here, these blends result in a high quality protein matrix. The whey protein is the highest quality protein that you can get. It comes from milk protein. It delivers the effective payload of leucine that we need to trigger that anabolic response. Collagen, that's the most abundant protein in our body, and sunflower protein augments some of the amino acids to the levels that we need to effectively remodel protein. There's more to this beverage as well. Carnitine, which is essentially a protein that enhances the transport of lipids into the mitochondria, and I've given you some references in all of these. I'm happy to share my presentation. And I think it's interesting that if you're going to give somebody a lipid-containing beverage, you should do something to enhance the uptake of these fatty acids into muscle, and that's exactly what carnitine does. There's a lot of other ingredients that you see on the label here, and what I've done for you here is to show what other potential benefits enhanced recovery might give you. The first is black cumin oil, and I'm sure a lot of you are saying, geez, I've never heard of that. Now, the interesting part is when you do a search on its more technical name here, which is Nigella sativa, you can actually come up with a lot of potential benefits from a holistic medicine standpoint that talk about the components, particularly something called thymoquinone, in cancer, in heart disease, in diabetes. So this is not an idle ingredient just thrown in to sort of add something to the label. There are lots of potential benefits from this. I'll just mention as well that other potential benefits around omega-3 fatty acids might relate to concussion. I'd be the first to admit that good human clinical trials have not been done in this area. But when we talk about the amount of these omega-3 fatty acids that are delivered in this beverage, it's impressive. There is almost 800 milligrams of docosahexaenoic acid, 500 milligrams of eicosapentaenoic acid, and 230 milligrams of alpha-linolenic acid. These are all what are called essential fats. In other words, we can't make these two fats, but we require them, so we have to eat them. Usually people would recommend fish. I would say that most athletes and most people in general, unless you're from Scandinavia, I'll agree to that, do not consume enough fish or enough omega-3 fatty acids to make a difference. This can be obtained from something like flaxseed, but it's remarkably difficult and most people do not consume enough. And these are some references that you might want to check out and look and see the relationship or the proposed relationship between omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids and concussion. By no means conclusive evidence at this point, but I think the future looks fairly bright. We currently lack any sort of intervention which could reduce the incidence and possibly the severity of concussion. So I think this is a terrific area for further research. One of the last things I want to say after talking about enhanced recovery for almost half an hour is that it's going to change. It's the new name, same great product. So enhanced recovery is soon going to be enhanced omega-3 to emphasize the fact that it is the only sports drink that effectively delivers this enhanced payload of omega-3 fatty acids in a highly digestible, non-oxidized format. I don't know of another sports drink on the market that can do that. So some take-home points. What have I told you? First of all, the stimulation of muscle protein synthesis is the predominant mechanism that dictates changes in muscle protein mass. You cannot effectively remodel proteins, you cannot effectively remodel proteins without stimulating muscle protein synthesis. The main stimuli for muscle protein synthesis is feeding, which is transient, and loading or exercise, which is long-lasting. And exercise effectively enhances the effect of all protein that's consumed in the post-exercise period. Unfortunately, aging and inactivity or taking time off for too long a period negatively impacts meal-induced rises in muscle protein synthesis. So it may be true that older athletes might want to emphasize some of these nutraceutical supplements to enhance their recovery. Pre-sleep protein may be important to remodel and recondition proteins, but perhaps for only highly active persons like the athletes that I know a lot of you deal with. The main driver for muscle protein synthesis with feeding is leucine. It's the key amino acid. In fact, it's probably the amino acid that kickstarts the whole process, and the rest of the essential amino acids are the supporting cast that follows after that. So proteins rich in leucine support greater rates of muscle protein synthesis. We've shown this acutely in the few hours post-exercise, but also chronically over a series of days and weeks. Multi-ingredient supplements offer broader benefits, and the reason they do that is because they cover multiple pathways that need to be stimulated to result in effective recovery and adaptation. Enhanced recovery, soon to be enhanced omega-3, offers a broad range of benefits in a single, convenient, and great tasting beverage. You'd have to taste it, obviously, to make your own mind up, but I'd be willing to bet that all of you will find exactly the same as I have. There's nothing out there that really touches it in terms of its taste profile. I want to thank you very much for your time and your attention, and hopefully I've given you something to think about and maybe ask some questions, which I'd be happy to take right now. Thank you.